I want to introduce now the Chief Executive of the UK Green Building Council, Paul King.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, and thank you for the invitation to take part in this event, which is very inspiring, very informative, and I'm also, I have to say, particularly delighted to be sharing a panel with Diana. And forgive the familiarity, but I find it easier to say Diana than your surname. But I think we all actually owe her a huge debt of gratitude, because the evidence she has applied to the IPCC, I think, has been fundamental to certainly what we've been able to achieve in the last few years in the UK and much more globally, I think, on this agenda. I want to take a little bit of time to give you a bit of insight into the UK Green Building Council. I'm not going to try and paint the whole picture of the Green Building Council, but I guess I want to emphasise some areas which are sometimes seen as slightly different from other models of Green Building Council. And that is particularly around the area of influencing government policy and the interplay between government policy and industry practice, and in particular to cut carbon. We're actually interested in a broader agenda, a much more holistic, sustainable development agenda in the UK Green Building Council, but I'm just going to focus on this area of carbon. It seems like a topical thing to do. This is the mission of the UK Green Building Council. It's not the most beautiful piece of prose I could present to you, but then again, I didn't write it. It was actually written by a group of my founder members before I was taken on to run the council. I think the reason it's still here, and I'm keen to draw it to your attention, is because it talks about dramatic improvement. It talks about radically transforming the way that the built environment is planned, designed, constructed, maintained and operated. So we're in the business of looking at transformation of the sustainability of the built environment throughout the entire life cycle. When I came along and joined the council in the early days, I decided to give it a strapline. And I decided to call the UK Green Building Council a campaign for a sustainable built environment. This was a slightly unusual thing to do, not for me, because actually I came from a campaigning background. My last job was as Director of Campaigns for the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, in the UK. But it was rather unusual for an industry-led NGO, such as the Green Building Council. People in business do not typically think of themselves as campaigners. But my view of campaigning is much broader than some people's. It's about seeing things which are wrong and seeking to change them for something better. And I think who is better placed to change things, actually, than the people at the heart of a particular industry. That's why we're a campaign. And what we seek to do, in a nutshell, is three things. We seek to provide and share information, examples of best practice and so on, between our members and indeed a much broader audience. We enable our members to take action, and I'll explain a bit more what I mean about that in a moment, and with the aim of influencing both government policy and industry practice to deliver a more sustainable built environment. So that's what we're all about. Now, as I mentioned earlier when Scott was speaking, when the UK Green Building Council was born just 3 years ago, we were by far the only, we were just the latest player in the green building scene in the UK. It was already a very crowded marketplace, very different from some of the other new and emerging green building council environments. And so it was essential that we found our way. And I'll come back to that in a moment, but I just want to take a step back in time to, I guess, my first involvement with the area of green and sustainable buildings. And this takes us back actually 10 years. 10 years ago, I found myself trudging around a muddy building site in an unprepossessing part of South London called Hackbridge, which was the site for BEDZ. Now, I dare say some of you will have heard of BEDZ, which stands for the Beddington Zero Energy Development. This was the first housing and somewhat mixed-use development in the UK that really set out as its mission to try and create a place, create a small community that it would actually make it easy, affordable and attractive for people to live in a sustainable way. Some of my previous work at WWF concerned work around ecological footprinting, and it led us to the conclusion, and the findings of the WWF Living Planet report led us to the conclusion that if everybody around the world were living, consuming natural resources and emitting carbon dioxide at the same rate we are on average in the UK, we would need 3 planets to support us all. The challenge that arose from that is how on earth do we achieve 1 planet living? That's to say, how could we all live a decent quality of life but within the carrying capacity of the 1 planet that we've actually got? And in a way, that idea was behind the concept of BedZ. And as I say, this was my first exposure to the idea of green building. And it led me to ask, I guess, a pretty simple question, which is why, if we can achieve this 10 years ago in a place in South London with a development like BedZ, which reduced energy use by over 90% and achieved a whole host of other resource efficiencies and improved lifestyles for people, why aren't we doing that as a matter of course? How can we take these lessons from the very fringes of our housing and our building industry to the mainstream? And that then became the mission of a campaign that I launched from WWF called 1 Million Sustainable Homes, which was all about trying to overcome the barriers to moving this into the mainstream in the UK. That campaign played some part in prompting the government to establish a task force called the Sustainable Buildings Task Group. I brought together a multi-stakeholder group to ponder what could we do to bring about a transformation of the sustainability of our built environment. And that led to a number of different recommendations, but one which surfaced was that there really needed to be a single national standard or a national code to describe sustainable buildings and to begin with sustainable homes. And so we found ourselves, I'm rather shortcutting a rather long story, of course, but we found ourselves at the end of 2006. I found myself in a room in central London full of house builders in the main, and a minister that I'd been spending quite a lot of time with over the previous few months stood up on a platform and said, right, we're going to change the way we look at energy efficiency in our housing in the UK. And from 2016, that is 10 years away, all new homes will have to be built to be zero carbon, to have no net carbon emissions over the course of a year. And there will also be a code for sustainable homes, one single national standard by which we will measure the efficiency of these homes going forwards. This was a huge departure. I can't emphasize enough how much of a departure this was from the past. We'd been talking about incremental changes to our regulations in terms of energy efficiency as part of our broader building regulations since the 1960s. And it was a murky process conducted largely in the dark, with government coming along every couple of years and saying, I think it's time that we'd ratcheted up our regulations a little bit. The industry all rushing around to lobby against too big a change and saying it's going to be terribly counterproductive, it's going to be horribly expensive, Minister, and it will slow down all that essential housing supply. And a big battle went on and some kind of compromise was struck. And in this way, we kind of lurched from one step to the next. This swept that away, and it said for the very first time to the industry, right, here's the deal, implicitly, here's the deal. We expect you to make a fundamental step change, but you've got 10 years, and this is the roadmap. This is the policy roadmap that we're going to take. The regulations will change 3 times, in 2010, 2013, 2016. And you will have a single national standard. You won't have every planning authority in the country inventing their own standards that you've got to deal with. You'll get a national standard, you'll get a clear trajectory. That's the deal. And those builders bought in to that deal with some extraordinary results. It led then, as a next step, to the creation of the Zero Carbon 2016 Task Force that brought together a multidisciplinary group, a multi-stakeholder group, NGOs, house builders, energy companies, planners, all sorts of people to preside over the delivery on this target. And that really is the background, that's the setting into which the UK Green Building Council was born. I said one of the key things that the UK Green Building Council seeks to do is to enable action by its members. One of the things that I'm very proud of is the diversity of our membership. It was planned that way. When the founder member group was brought together to launch the Green Building Council, it was quite deliberate to go and seek architects, engineers, property developers, house builders, lawyers, agents, right across the built environment community. And that diversity has continued to grow as over the last 3 years, and it's worth mentioning, I think, that, you know, as you all know, the last half of the life of the UK Green Building Council has been in the deepest recession in living memory in our country and certainly in the minds of the construction industry. And our membership has grown tenfold in that period, and the diversity of the membership has continued to grow. And the membership is not only diverse across the private sector, but it also includes public sector agencies, academics, NGOs, charities, and others. So it's a truly diverse across all three sectors, a very diverse group. And so what we do when we seek to enable our members to take action towards a more sustainable built environment is we pose a particular question, a particular challenge, and then we bring together a multidisciplinary group from across those sectors to thrash it through. And so this is what we did actually in May 2008 with a task group that was asked to look at the definition of zero carbon. Because yes, we had a government target, we had a commitment that this would be enshrined in regulation in 10 years' time, but nobody actually knew what this meant. And it's one of those things that kind of happens where just occasionally a government minister takes a leap of faith and it has an extraordinary galvanizing effect. But the reality was, of course, that if this was going to become regulation, we were going to have to transcribe that into something meaningful that could be written down and applied to everybody. And so quite quickly, when we discovered actually the government was going to run into some trouble because it wasn't quite sure exactly how it was going to define zero carbon, we stepped forward and proposed a task group of our members. And we brought together some of the biggest house builders, some of the tiniest house builders, some of the environmental NGOs, some of the big energy companies, some of the product manufacturers, a set of people who all had a different idea of what the definition of zero carbon should be. And we locked them in a room, metaphorically, for around about 6 months. And it was a very lively and a very tense 6 months. And indeed, we got pretty close to the end of 5 3/4 months, wondering if we were ever going to actually achieve any kind of consensus. And at that point, suddenly the debate crystallized. And we emerged with a remarkably progressive consensus. Everybody, I think it's fair to say from that group, felt that they'd ended up in a different place from where they'd started, because they'd sat and they'd listened and they'd understood the perspectives of all the other stakeholders in the room. And they understood why they had to end up in a different place. Which is why when we were asked by the government to go and present our findings and our recommendations a month later, we were invited to go not just to one minister, but actually 4 ministers across 4 different of the key government departments, including the Treasury, to present our findings. And they couldn't quite believe that we'd been managed to bring such a diverse range of stakeholders together and have them agree on a way forward. And that set of recommendations included in this report went on to inform a formal government consultation based on those recommendations that have gone on to inform the current working definition of zero carbon, which is now basically accepted by all of those different stakeholders. The consensus not only lasted the kind of 2 weeks between reporting and presenting to ministers, it's actually survived the last 2.5 years. Just to give you an indication, I'm going to resist diving into some of the technicalities of the zero carbon debate, partly because I'm not a technical person, and I'll probably be outsmarted by somebody quite easily, but also because I haven't really got time to go there. But I'm happy to talk about it outside if anybody wants to. But I just wanted to give you a sense of how big a step change this is. Because unlike our counterparts in, say, Germany, Scandinavian countries and elsewhere, who have been on this for quite a long, on this journey for quite a long time and have a pretty solid track record, this represents some big catching up by the UK. The UK has been something of a laggard with respect to many other countries in Europe for a long time, and this is a very rapid acceleration, a very rapid catching up. And so what you see on this graph here is the size of the step change from when the announcement was made. And although the announcements were made in 2006, by then the regulation implied here at 2009 on the left-hand side of this graph was already in place, so the step change is the same. It wasn't just 100% change in terms of carbon savings from the building, it actually represented 150%. And the reason, slightly illogically, I guess, to talk about 150% reduction, but the reason for that is because our regulations only, of course, addressed a certain proportion of carbon emissions from buildings. They only dealt with the emissions associated with our heating and our lighting, the basic energy uses. And what everybody knew was that we all use, on average, at least 50% more energy than that in living in our homes, in doing our cooking, in watching our TVs, or playing on our home PCs. And so that was included, and an approximation of that, 50% was added to the total. So zero carbon in 10 years included an additional 50% of overall carbon emissions. That's the nature of the step we're talking about. It's very important to say that one of the, and I was reminded to say this when I was chatting to Diana over lunch, is that one of the very first things that we thrashed out in the task group that I just described was the fact that what you had to absolutely make sure in your definition of zero carbon was that energy efficiency came first. And what we were adamant about was that you had to set the energy efficiency threshold at the highest practicable level before you started to resort to renewable energy to meet your residual energy needs. And that, fortunately, has been carried forward and is now being enshrined in the regulations. And that's a hugely important part of this definition of zero carbon. Just as I was taking up my role with the Green Building Council in May 2007, I got a phone call from a senior official in our government saying, Paul, from your last job, you know all about the zero carbon homes and the co-sustainable homes policy. Should we be thinking now about new non-domestic buildings as well? We're checking this out with a few people. And I said, well, yes, of course you should. And they said, we thought you might say that. So they said, we'll go off and we'll talk to one of our big consultancies and they'll tell us how far and how fast it's reasonable to expect the industry to go. And I said, no, don't do that. I'll tell you what, ask us to do it instead. And I'll bring together another one of these multidisciplinary groups. I'll bring together some of the big consultants, some of the big architects, the engineers, some of the cost consultants, some of the agents, and some of the NGOs. And we'll have this debate for you. And I'll ask them to do it for no fee, by the way. And fortunately, the members agreed. And so 5 months later, we produced a report to the government which said, we think you should set a similar policy trajectory for new non-domestic buildings. That is, within a decade, you should be demanding that we are delivering zero carbon buildings. And when I went in to see the minister to hand her the findings of this report, she said, well, come on, Paul. She said, you know, 2 weeks ago you were here wearing a WWF hat. It's not particularly surprising that you're saying these things to me. And I said, yeah, but the difference is that I've just come from a meeting with 12 of the biggest developers in the UK, who I sat down and I checked these recommendations with, and I said, are you sure this is what you want me to say to the minister? And they agreed. And I saw the look on her face, and I realized this was a very powerful thing. That if the industry were prepared to step up to this agenda, if it were prepared to be proactive, it could completely change the nature of its dialogue with the government. It could say, we know this agenda is coming. Much better that we step up and we shape this agenda than be on the receiving end of some, frankly, rather ill-conceived policy further down the line. And that really is the philosophy that's emerged and has informed multiple task groups and multiple areas of policy that we've got involved in. And those set of recommendations, as it says here, that we presented to the minister 5 months really into the existence of the Green Building Council, 3 months later led to our Chancellor standing up in his budget speech and setting the government aspiration for all buildings to be zero carbon within a decade by 2019, and public sector buildings to get there a year earlier. But, of course, it's all well and good dealing with the new buildings, as we've heard several times already today. But even in a good year for the construction industry, new buildings only account for about 1%. 99% are the ones that are already standing. And if you look ahead, and we have a particularly big target, which I'll illustrate for you in a minute in the UK, to achieve an 80%, at least an 80% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050. If you project forward to 2050, we know that over 80% of the buildings going to be standing in 2050 are already standing, are already in use today. So to coin a phrase, it's the existing stock, stupid. We have to fundamentally get to grips with this, and that's why we began to divert the attention of the UK Green Building Council increasingly into our existing stock, our existing homes. In the UK, we have 26 million rather leaky homes, rather inefficient homes. And so the summer before last, we brought together, I think it was about 300 different organizations to discuss what are the barriers, why are we failing to address this terribly leaky stock. And as Diana's pointed out, this isn't just about carbon emissions, this is about people living in fuel poverty, this is about people, even if they're not technically within fuel poverty, wasting a huge amount of energy and money on inefficient buildings, with all of the social consequences and so on of that. quite apart from certainly a growing concern in the UK, which is the ever-growing issue of energy security. We were complacent back in the late 70s when we discovered North Sea oil and gas. We didn't start to make the steps towards energy efficiency that some other European countries did, and we're now paying the price for that. And funnily enough, after about 6 months of dialogue, we came up with a set of barriers which really are not rocket science. What we found, quite simply, was that people said, it's too expensive, there's too much hassle, and it's really pretty unattractive. And so the challenge became, okay, if that's the problem, how do we turn that on its head? How do we make proper home refurbishment easy, affordable, and attractive? And so that's our mission now. How do we look at refurbishment of homes and existing buildings and make it easy, affordable, and attractive? And I'll just highlight one of the strands of work that we're doing to follow up on that. And there's another report you can see the executive summary of here, which is another report from one of our multi-disciplinary task groups, which was looking at overcoming the upfront cost barrier. Typically, in the UK, statistically, apparently, we move home every 7 years. So if you're looking at fundamental refurbishment measures and you're looking at significant upfront capital costs, the payback may not happen. In many cases, it won't happen within 7 years. So many people simply say, well, if I'm not going to get the benefit back within the time I'm going to live here, I'm not going to bother. It's somebody else's problem. So that was the fundamental thing that had to be overcome. So we developed, through our membership, a mechanism which we've called Pay As You Save. There are similar mechanisms being developed elsewhere in the world that basically says, okay, let's invite some people to put some money into a pot, and we will promise them that they'll get a return on that investment. I'll come back to that. We'll promise to give them a return on their investment. We will then say to people, okay, you can draw down some of this money and you can improve your home to a very good level of energy efficiency. And then we will attach a charge, a standing charge to your home that you will pay on a quarterly basis. And the charge that you repay will be less than the money that you're saving on your energy bills. So from day one, there is no upfront capital cost, and from day one, you are better off because your energy bills are less and you're saving more than you're repaying on your charge. Now, of course, there are all sorts of variables that underpin those assumptions. And we modeled this in a number of different ways, but we showed that even if energy prices were 30% less than they were today, which frankly was pretty unlikely, this could still work. With a payback over 25 years, people would still be better off. And the people supplying the money and putting the money in the pot could be guaranteed a 6% return on their investment. When we started that modeling, that looked quite a conservative kind of a fairly low return on investment. Now that looks like a pretty good return on investment. So everybody's happy. And I'm delighted to say in the last 3 days, the 3 main political parties in the UK have published their manifestos for the general election in 3 weeks' time, and all 3 have committed to introduce this mechanism. So we're making a bit of progress, and there is some room for optimism. And it was rather nice when we held an event at the House of Commons last September when our climate change minister, David Kidney, stood up and said to the audience, some of whom were UKGBC members and some were prospective members, if you want to change, continue to change and shape government policy, the best way to do it is through your membership of the UK Green Building Council. So I couldn't resist putting that up. That, to give you an indication of the scale of the task, is what an 80% reduction in emissions from our buildings in the UK looks like. To give you an idea, you can't read the scale on that, I appreciate. Those different colour stripes are different types of buildings. The big pink area at the bottom is our existing housing stock. That gives you an idea of the scale of the challenge. And just to put that into the broader context of what the UK is trying to do, that's what the graph looks like for the whole economy. That's what we've got to achieve an 80% reduction by 2050. So as we know, that challenge applies and is an even greater challenge, a more humongous challenge, to coin a phrase, at the global level. And that's one of the reasons why many of us in the Green Building Councils are so keen and enthusiastic to be members of the World Green Building Council. Because however successful we are, and heaven knows we've only just made a very small start in the UK, but however successful we get in our own countries, unless we aggregate that achievement, unless we begin to precipitate a global change, we will have failed. Because climate change doesn't respect national boundaries. It doesn't discriminate. We will all cook together. I don't need to repeat these. In fact, I removed the IPCC graph out of respect for Diana that I normally put here, but she's said all of these things. We know how big a deal our energy use in buildings is at a global scale. Fortunately, we know that buildings provide some of the best and most cost-effective opportunities for carbon mitigation as well. So there is a fantastic opportunity, and frankly, there is a fantastic responsibility on us to actually seize that opportunity. So that is why, towards the end of 2008, we started the World Green Building Council Policy Task Force. Jane would be disappointed if I didn't use this phrase. I was keen that we began to become more than the sum of our parts. How could we act together and create something bigger than what we all are on our own as individual councils? What we wanted to do was begin to speak with an increasingly common voice across the world through the Green Building Council network on global issues. We wanted to enable and build capacity between councils to develop more effective relationships and understanding between the industry and governments, and within that context we wanted to prioritise carbon as our #1 issue. Last year, for the very first time, on 23rd of September, we celebrated World Green Building Day. We had synchronized events going on around the world. We had events in Taiwan, in South Africa, in Australia, in New Zealand, in the US, in the UK, in Germany, and so on, all with a common message. All of these events focused on our national delegations who were going to be heading off, in most cases, to Copenhagen, and saying buildings should be at the very top of your agenda for change. We began a process of forming partnerships. We don't want to be one voice competing against other voices. Much better that we, as a global community interested in green building, join up with others. So we formed partnerships with people like the Sustainable Buildings Alliance, with UNEP SPCI and others, and we rallied behind the industry call to action coordinated by UNEP to present that message at Copenhagen. We also rallied around to begin to capture some of the best examples, some of the best case studies of green building, of carbon saving, policy mechanisms and other initiatives initiated by green building councils, and we put those into our first World GBC case studies report, which is available from the World GBC. Going forward, what we need to do, of course, is massively build on the momentum of this initiative and our collective impact. Again, this year, we'll be celebrating World Green Building Day in September. Again, the message will be consistent. Again, we'll be targeting our national governments, the delegations, to the next COP meeting in Mexico at the end of this year. We're also going to be organising events with our partner GBC in Mexico to actually show some of the politicians the reality, particularly relevant in a context like Mexico, where the social benefits of green and sustainable building so clearly go hand in hand with carbon savings. So that's something to be pretty excited about. And looking further ahead, we're looking to creating a platform for the World Green Building community at Brazil, the next Earth Summit, 10 years on from Johannesburg, which was 10 years on from Rio. Because we believe, as is so obvious from what you've already heard, that the green building agenda is something that really needs to be tackled at both a global and a local level. And we have a huge opportunity and responsibility to act. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for your comments. I'd like to invite and have Jane Henley, the Chief Executive for the World Green Building Council, to facilitate the question period. Thank you. So your questions.
Thank you, Paul and Diana. For me, it's quite an interesting insight into the role of research and information and the implementation side of what we're all quite focused on every day in business or as a Green Building Council. And I think Paul's model of a GBC really highlights a gap in many GBCs, that we're not focused very heavily on the link through to policy. So I think it's quite timely that we are starting to have this conversation, and it was great that you put the challenge out to us to focus more on our conversation with governments, because if we don't, there is a gap there, because you're obviously, researching and have the information. I guess my first question to you before I go to the floor is, you know, what you talked about, that it's not a green movement, and that, you know, that I guess my question is, are you presenting to the economists? How often are you actually having these conversations to the people that need to hear about these finance mechanisms that Paul's talking about, pay as you go, solving the problems and Jerry mentioned this morning around it's not necessarily an investment problem we have in solving the green building, existing building problem, it's a finance problem. So your research has got some great evidence there. Are you talking to the economists? Do we need to be doing that as well? What should we do in that space?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm afraid that's a tough question. And it's true that we just talk about this and not sufficiently to the people who really need to understand this. But the way how I first even started to shift the focus of the target audience was that, you know, when we talk climate change or when we talk sustainability, yes, you get big applauses, you get to be invited to speak at many conferences and events and so on, but then as soon as it gets to action, that's it. But when I worked with the Hungarian government and when I just started to mention employment and social welfare effects, suddenly they started, okay, well, say that again, how was that? Let's put the task force together, let's think now. So actually, I think this is not an agenda that should be done at the Environment Ministry, but it's for the social ministries, the ministries responsible for employment, the economics and finance. Unfortunately, the economics and finance parts who listen least, but at least those who deal with employment and social welfare and housing, I think those already started to listen. That's my perception. Yeah, in Hungary, politicians listen, and in fact, it's possible that with the forming government that's coming in, we will have actually a massive retrofit program in Hungary. So the politicians listen, and that's good, but they don't listen if you just talk environment and climate change. In Hungary, it's just, yeah, it's very important, but sorry, we just have much more important things to do right now.
That's a good point. So it's around getting the messaging right and the language right, which I think clearly Paul's done very well. So you can articulate very complex messages to the right audiences at the right time. So I think that's a good takeaway for some of the GBCs in the audience. Okay, I'm not going to ask all my 6 questions here. I'm going to let you have an opportunity, but if you don't have any, I'm more than willing. So, okay, we've got one down here.
Hello, I'm Darcy Nicole from United Technologies. I have a question more related to governments. You talked, Paul, about non-domestic buildings and domestic buildings. How do you think that the ministers would react that they should introduce this funding mechanism, for example, to the publicly owned sector first? So you have incentives for people who operate museums, universities, ministry buildings to have real incentives to improve the performance of their own buildings. And for example, to keep the savings they have. It seems in many governments in Europe, if you do succeed in making energy reductions, you lose your budget. So you have no incentive there. And I thought it'd be important for the public sector to show a good example for doing a retrofit, because they are very large owners of existing building stock.
I'll have a go at that. To be honest, there hasn't been as much progress as there should have been on that so far in the UK. It's interesting, it does feature quite prominently in one of the 3 manifestos I've been scrutinising this week. Unfortunately, it's the one that's least likely to get into government. I have to be careful what I say. But I think it's an important idea. I mean, certainly one of the things that we have seen in the way that the UK has chosen to implement the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive is with the rolling out of the display energy certificates. As you may know, we've now got almost uniform rolling out of the energy performance certificates, focusing on the asset rating of buildings, i.e. how they're supposed to perform. So far, we're only rolling out the display energy certificates, how buildings actually perform in operation, to public buildings, public sector buildings. And that has prompted some pretty interesting results, because what we've seen is the difference between the EPCs on these buildings and the actual rating. Although in itself that's quite interesting. The press, of course, love to seize on these opportunities to point the finger at government and say what a terrible lead it's showing. And so the department responsible for implementing the regulation itself, their head office, I think was given an EPC of, it was either a B or a C, and it was given a DEC of an F. But of course, what it told them was that something's going wrong here, or at least something, this building is not performing how you expected it to perform. And what they found was actually they had crammed in twice as many people as they'd expected to, with twice as many computers and everything else. And they had a faulty boiler, which needed replacing. And on the one hand, they said, well, actually, it works perfectly okay with twice as many people in, but we need to fix the boiler. And the point is, of course, that most people simply don't have the information. People have no idea whether they're occupying an efficient or an inefficient building, and whether they're occupying it efficiently or not. And so I think that the rolling out of the labeling is an essential first step to actually give people the information. They then need to actually make the improvements. And then I think we can look at how they're funded, either by public or by the private sector.
Do we have another question, or do I get one? Oh, you can have a turn then. Okay.
Yeah, I would have two questions, one to Gianna and one to Paul. I was wondering whether you have any ideas about what should we expect, what should we expect from ourselves in Germany. Now in Germany this year and in Mexico, do you think we could correct the mistakes done, probably also by our lobby in Copenhagen? And of course I wanted to mention, because I personally also know the Solar Nova example you mentioned of deep refurbishment, that currently in Hungary, one investment per flat to cut around 40% of emission is around 6,000 euros. And the Solar Nova investment was around 30,000 euros. So basically, it's not about the fact that it doesn't pay back. It's much more an issue of pre-financing. And if you think from a banking perspective, in a 10 or 20 years, it's also an issue of refinancing. So from a financing perspective, there is a huge barrier that doesn't let us unlock this potential that you are talking about. And I was also wondering, because I'm probably one of the few people that are personally aware with the PACE, as you say, scheme, as we were involved in the development of the idea. Whether you think that the scheme is going to work only for the housing, the public housing sector in the UK, the social housing sector, or do you think it's going to cross the boundaries to the private owned sector? Because I think there is a certain problem there, and I was wondering what's your opinion on it? And of course, what do you think about whether the Green Building Council and similar organizations could work as a powerful lobby to counter the negative lobbying power of the fuel industry, which I was mentioning this before to Diana very often, that whenever we show a high number of decrease in expense, we always show to certain industries a high number of losses in income, future losses, of course. Thank you.
Do you want to start with that first question? I think it was around, well, I'll reframe it. What could we do better to get COP16 right? And what could the lobby from, what you were saying, the German Green Building Council? Or from the German government, what could we do better to get buildings on the agenda at COP16? Yeah? Should we start with that one? I think that's a great question.
I'm afraid I have no magic answers to that. I just throw balls. For me, it's easy. I think you have to answer what you have to do. But I think we need at least more events. That's one. Second, I think we need to persuade that it shouldn't be only buildings events. The buildings should be on the agenda of general climate change, the mitigation events and adaptation events as an important part, because those people who already come to a building event, they are already probably persuaded that this is important. And that was my concern, that I went to the EU panel, the EU pavilion or the US pavilion or whatever, when you heard, general technology showcasing or buildings were not there because it's not sexy. There are lots of sexy things. I think we really need to make this more sexy. I think energy efficiency in buildings are sexy, but many people just don't think so. This has been around for so long. It's just somehow we need to give it more sex appeal, but I think you probably will have to have more creative ideas than I do.
I think I don't think it's going to be a walk in the park to get building center stage in Mexico, for sure. I think we're beginning to make some inroads. I think many of the co-benefits that have been described earlier and also built upon by Diana here this afternoon is one way of engaging a much broader spectrum of politicians and of getting profile. So looking at the social benefits, looking at the energy security benefits and all those others, in addition to carbon, generally means that we can get buildings up the agenda. One of the things that I'm grappling with our government in the UK at the moment is the fact that buildings, and I don't know how typical this is, I'm sure our many different governments deal with buildings in many different ways. One of the problems that we've got is that ownership accountability for buildings is spread across multiple ministries. And whereas we have, one of the reasons that we've made most progress on new homes is that we have one very clear housing minister who is very focused on new homes. Trying to find a minister who feels accountable for non-domestic buildings is much more challenging. It falls across different portfolios. And I'm a great believer in a lot of change coming on the back of forging relationships with people. And if this slips between stores and you can't speak to someone and say, you know, my proposition, one of the things I'm saying to our government at the moment is, look at the breakdown of the UK's emissions. We've now got legally binding targets. 17% of the UK's total emissions as defined result from our non-domestic buildings. Who in the government is accountable for that 17%? And that's kind of a live discussion. So I think the government itself needs to get its head around this sector. I agree, it hasn't been seen as a sexy sector. Increasingly, bits of government are getting a bit more excited about the new technology bits of this. They think, oh, this is high tech, this is new tech, this is something that we want to be competitive about, but it ought to be so much more than that. And I think, you know, we just have to keep banging the drum in terms of the scale of the opportunity in all those different ways, in terms of economic activity and prosperity, in terms of jobs, in terms of energy security, in terms of affordable warmth, in terms of all those things, and carbon, to try and get it up the agenda. And we have to, you know, we were kind of flattered and felt good about the fact that people were saying in the run-up and to Copenhagen and at Copenhagen that people were saying, yes, you're right, that the buildings should be part of the nationally appropriate mitigation actions. But it was quite clear that it was about saying, but these are only things to be dealt with at the national level. It's quite clear to me that this has to be something that needs to be dealt with at the international level as well. But I don't have any magic answers. We'll just keep banging away for the time being, see how we get on. There was a question about pay as you save and the private sector. Should I pick that one up quickly?
Okay, we'll answer that one quickly, and I realise we're running over time, aren't we, Steve? But answer that one quickly.
Okay.
Yeah?
We absolutely think that it can work in the private sector, and in fact, most of our focus has been on the private sector application of that. We actually had a subgroup looking at social housing, but our priority was to actually make it work in this sector. And what we found is that we think there's quite a lot of opportunity for completely new actors to get into this space. We've been approached, we've had conversations with some of the biggest supermarkets in the UK that have got very, very high levels of customer loyalty, who think that they could actually front this, they could present this proposition to the consumer. If they've got sort of a watertight financial proposition, and they can also then, it takes us on to other aspects of this, if they can then introduce accredited installer suppliers to actually carry out the work, they can actually present this as a consumer proposition, as a new service. So we think, yeah, there's great potential.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your fantastic presentation of complex information. Well, I know I've seen some presentations on these topics which are quite hard to understand, so that was fantastic. And it's great to see that we're in good hands over here in the UK with some good models and some good examples about how we can do this in our own countries. So this is and will be a very important agenda for the World GBC moving forward. So thank you to you both, and I'd like you all to join me in thanking the speakers.